We gotta rise up, rise up, rise up. They say it's to protect you while they try to dispossess you of the right to decide between wrong or right, to openly discuss what politicians hide. They want to keep their secret plans from the public eye. We gotta keep our fires burning, keep our spirits bright. We gotta rise up, rise up, rise up. Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people. Money got no children, and bombs ain't for building, and killing ain't no way to make a peaceful day, as all of God's children can easily explain. We gotta keep our fires burning, keep our spirits bright, stand up and speak for what we know is right. We gotta rise up, rise up, rise up. Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people. I see days ahead. Kiss my children into bed. All across the planet, that everything is fine. Yeah! Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people. We got the power and the will, and we'll do it for our children. Put the warmongers and the corporate whores in the history books with the dinosaurs. I claim my power, I claim my rights, and no dirty tricks are gonna change my mind. I'm gonna rise up, rise up, rise up. I'm gonna rise up, rise up, rise up. Rise up, people, against the war. 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 Rise up.
Well, this is Dan Shea with Veterans for Peace Forum. We've had some number of great programs lately, and then we're going to have another one this evening. This is Veterans for Peace Forum at Metro East Community Media out here in Gresham. I want to thank again my producers of this program, Kelly Labonte and Jim Lockhart, who are always doing some magic back there behind the screen. There's a couple of things today. I wanted to mention a few things. We're going to have my guest today is going to be Steve Gardiner. He's a professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Science. Is that Zayed?
Zayed.
Zayed University in Abu Dhabi. And Steve happens to be my cousin, so we go back long ways. But before we get to the interview, I want to mention a couple of things. We've been, this program is about veterans. Steve is also a veteran, served in Germany for a period of time and as a E4 specialist. Last month we had Benji Lewis with LT, Laura Taylor. Benji's an Iraqi veteran who had gone down to Venezuela and spent some 10 months there. That program is now up on YouTube. And it's being seen all over the world, which is really great for me, and I hope the same thing happens with this program. The other thing is when Benji was here, he was talking about economic crisis. And as I was looking through a paper here the other day, it was an old one, it just happened to be in my car from Street Roots. We talk about how the war affects our economy and what that means to us at home. And as we started looking here, I was looking at things that were being cut. Seniors and People with Disabilities Division, Oregon Projects Independence, was cutting $7 million to that program, which mainly serves people age 60 and older diagnosed with Alzheimer's and related dementia disorders. Medicaid program, Medicaid Personal Care Program, cut $2,375,000. Nearly 1,200 Oregonians, some 882 aged and physically disabled clients, 292 mentally disabled clients. I mean, these are services that are being cut one right after the other. Another one was developmental disabled family support, cutting $1.8 million. Provides assistance to families raising children with developmental disabilities. You know, I mean, as I started looking through one program after the next, and I've got 2 pages here, you know, of people, all these various cuts that they're affecting people, and oftentimes these cuts are affecting women and children. And when we began to look at that, I also, before I get back into that, I just wanted to just put that point out there that we're dealing with the economy, we're dealing with big issues that are hitting us right now. It would be how the immigration movement in Arizona, this Bill 1070, which was requiring police to pick up anybody who looked like an immigrant and be required by law. If those police didn't, they could be sued and be prosecuted themselves. Well, a recent event just happened here in Portland. I was on last Thursday, and it's kind of a shout out for me. I'm shouting out to Mike Crenshaw and Adam Carpinelli, who with the Portland Central American Solidarity Committee put together a program, Drop Beats, Not Bombs. And this was for Peace Immigrant Movement Convergence for No Soy El Army Tour. And this was to bring together the Latino community, those young men and women who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan and who were still considered illegal immigrants, but had served in promise of, or hopes of, not so much promises, but hopes of getting their citizenship, and a number of those people are being deported today. So a great program, and it's being sponsored by Portland Central American Solidarity Committee, the American Friends Service Committee, and the Rural Organizing Project. And so there's a woman who I happened to meet at this event, Marcela Guzman, who served in the U.S. Navy and now works with women of color. She works for the Women of Color Center in Los Angeles area, and her focus is working with women about the realities of the military service and the effects on young women. And we know that when we've had other people on here, that women who served, they faced discrimination up the ranks, sexual harassment, rape and sexual harassment, and those that have reported those things, they actually, like Suzanne Swift, who, when she tried to report that, you know, they just ignored her, and then when she was going to be sent back, she went AWOL. When she went AWOL, then she was prosecuted. When she tried to bring out her case, they kept that sort of harassment going. So there are a lot of different things, but with that, I'm just talking about what's happening to us here in America. But then we start looking at what's happening to people around the world. What does our policies, our military interventions, our war and now occupations mean to the people in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the neighboring countries? You were in Pakistan when you started to teach over there. You want to tell us a little bit how you got there and why you headed over there and what period of time that was?
Well, it was 2007. I'd been living in small towns in the American Midwest, teaching at small colleges for the most part, and Angie Reed, my partner, and I, we decided that it would be an interesting kind of situation, an interesting time to try to live in a Muslim majority country, and have that experience, especially because both of us were feeling at that point towards the end of the Bush administration a bit surreal about being in the United States. So we were out of the country when living in Germany. When 9/11 happened, we came back, deluged with all the flags and so on. And for the next several years, we really felt out of place. And so we decided, well, let's expatriate for a few years and see how things are going. So we moved to Lahore in the east of Pakistan, near India.
And sort of the Paris of Pakistan?
Yes, yeah? Yes, and very old and highly cultured city.
How many universities are there?
There's dozens of universities in that part of the Punjab. And wonderful food, lovely people. And of course everyone said, well, you can't go to Pakistan, you'll die. And I said, well, you know, there have been one American killed in Pakistan in the last 30 years until recently. It's probably not as dangerous as my neighborhood in the west side of Chicago that I lived in. Yeah.
But then it started to get a little hairy there because there was elections going on and...
Well, in the end of 2007, Benazir Bhutto was assassinated under very suspicious circumstances that everyone in the country considers them to be. Everyone has their own pet conspiracy theory about what happened, but there were riots in the aftermath. And since that time, it marked the beginning of the end of the military dictatorship of Parvez Musharraf. He left power more or less voluntarily. The United States has sort of started to pull the rug out from under him after years of support. Basically, they paid the Pakistani army to support the United States in the war in Afghanistan. But at that point, he was on the way out. The new president, who's still president in Pakistan, Zardari, came to power. Not well supported by the military there, which is the most important institution in Pakistan. And since that time, there have started to be a number of bombings in the city of Lahore, which there had not previously been in that part of the country. And sort of the last one before we left was close enough to where we lived to shake the windows at our place.
Mm-hmm. And when you say the bombings, was this considered to be just people rioting, or was this connected to the so-called refugees coming from Afghanistan? And
the bombings in Lahore have been the attacks in Lahore are of several different kinds. I mean, you hear about quote-unquote terrorism in Pakistan, but in fact most of that is internal conflicts between different ethnic groups, between different religious sects, between Sunni and Shia, and against religious minorities like the Ahmadi in Pakistan. But these particular bombings in Lahore were carried out by the Pakistani Taliban, the Tikriti Taliban, or at least they claimed it, and most people didn't doubt it. And that's sort of a pretty good barometer, because Pakistanis have a strong tendency to doubt everything their government tells them, probably healthy skepticism. But they didn't really doubt that the Pakistani Taliban was behind the bombings in Lahore as retaliation against government attempts to repress Taliban activity in the north of Pakistan.
Mm-hmm. Now, last time you came here, you showed me a number of these war rugs that you had brought home, and you showed me those, and I was saying, boy, I sure want to get a few of those, you know. But you showed up this time and you gave me one. If you'd put up that war rug, I'd like people to see what that is. But this is the war rug here, and if you could tell them a little bit about what these are and who's doing those.
All right. Well, the war rugs are from Afghanistan, particularly by the Dari-speaking peoples in Afghanistan, who are not so much part of the Taliban, the Pusht, which is the Taliban. You need to remember is an ethnic-based organization, almost entirely among the Pushtun peoples, and Dari is a Persian language, And these rugs started to be made during the Soviet occupation. And they basically record the existential sense of being immersed year after year in a war culture. They're called war rugs. They come in all different sizes. This one shows, it's from 2002 when the initial attempts to go into the Tora Bora Mountains, where at the time there were some Al-Qaeda strongholds there, and the initial special forces ops in Tora Bora to try to go after him. So it commemorates that, but it also shows the memory of the Soviet tanks leaving Afghanistan in 1988, 1989. You can see the various weapons that are so common there. They make replicas of them in the Khyber Pass on both sides of the border. People hand make these weapons, Kalashnikov replicas, rocket-propelled grenades. And then you can see that these rugs, that they're in English and they're made for export to English speakers, but the writing is not correct because, of course, the people making them don't speak English. So it's being copied and not necessarily all fitted on. And you can see where Afghanistan sits here between Pakistan, China to the north, Kazakhstan, and then Iran to the south.
Well, I really, this is a treasure to me. As an artist, I remember back in the 1980s, we had Children of War art display, which was children in refugee camps that were putting together work that they saw of helicopters shooting down their parents and even the Contras coming in and killing their mothers and fathers. And this artwork said so much, but it's also a record of the history of what was going on. It's in this kind of thing, it's almost like creating a tapestry of that history and recording it in thread.
There really are a sense of this was. Some of them, in fact, show the Twin Towers being hit by the jets, and you look at them, and they're incredibly dense in an artistic sense. It's hard to read. Is this, a celebration of that? No, it isn't. It's the same thing as what happened with these rugs commemorating the Soviet occupation and the American invasion. It's an existential record. It's saying this happened. It was important. Pay attention.
That's incredible, and I mean that's one way in which people communicate, and they also have their stories and their history passed down from generation to generation. One of the things too is that we in America happen to write down our stories, and when we began talking about, you were saying pulling the rug out, and then we have the rug, and then as we began talking about these things, you were co-authored a chapter for a book called Women, War, and Violence, a personal perspective of global activism. And these are, I was just talking about how women were being affected by war. Tell me about what this chapter is about and what this book is about.
Well, the book really covers a lot of ground, dealing with issues like the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war, in genocide in the Congo, in Bosnia, in various parts of the world. It talks about how militarization of societies affects local economies, how that affects women and children, how militarization of nations drives genders apart by creating strong gender expectations for sort of tough men and tender women. So the book covers a lot of ground. It will be out. It's a Palgrave Macmillan book. It will be out in the fall. It's available for order now through Amazon and so on. It's a bit expensive for individual purchase. So if you're interested, encourage your library to get a copy and recommend that they make it available for Kindle, where it would be a lot cheaper.
Yeah, you showed me that Kindle that you have for reading, especially if people, like I used to try and send books to Africa, and We sent some 10,000 back in 2000, I believe, in 2001, and to Somalia, Somaliland. And I mean, it would cost a fortune, but if you're talking about, you can almost send a library, a full library on one of these little Kindles. So for what, 159 to 100 bucks, you can send it to another country, to a school, and the children can look at that and read almost anything, if they're learning English at least, right?
Right, right. I mean, it's a really helpful, I mean, of course, the Kindle is a proprietary device from Amazon, but there are similar readers, more generic, that are available as well. And I'm sure that with some ingenuity, they could be made available through from India, for example, for 25 bucks or something. Right.
Well, let's go back and what's your essay in this? You were in Angie Reed's in this book.
As I said before, we went to Pakistan. We were in these small Midwest towns, and I'm an anthropologist by training. I have a PhD in cultural anthropology, and I did my PhD work on the military and society in Germany. So I was looking around for a kind of research that I would be interested in doing in small town America, and I set on to doing work with veterans, veterans who were parts of organizations, and sort of how veterans conceived of the many different ways that veterans conceive of how their experiences have had a continuing impact on their lives, and how for lots of people that becomes more apparent many years later. People get out of the service, and many times the last thing they want to think of is, okay, now I'm a veteran, what does that mean? But 20 years on, it sometimes becomes a big part of people's lives. Well, anyway, we did this work. Angie Reed, my partner, got involved with it, and one of the editors of this volume invited me to submit a chapter. She'd heard about my work, but the focus was on women, and so I was coming up with an idea, and it was actually Angie Reed who suggested, well, you know, one of the most interesting things that we found out about is the ways in which women who are family members, not women soldiers, but women who have sons or daughters who are in the military, mothers in particular, are frozen out of communications with their soldier and veteran sons and daughters because of the code, this code of operational security, the code of you don't talk about it. And we ran into a couple of different women who had become very active in traditional veterans organizations like American Legion, Veterans, VFW, specifically for the reason of getting some kind of liaison to their soldier sons who were serving in Iraq, and trying to find out, what does this mean when he writes this? And in particular, one of these young men who was an intelligence officer, intelligence analyst, enlisted man, worked in signals, doing decoding of enemy transmissions. This is in the early part of the invasion of Iraq. He had sent a picture home, and he's standing in a drained out swimming pool in Iraq, in Baghdad, next to another soldier, and he's carrying a saw over his shoulder, squad automatic weapon. And so she takes this photo, and she says, oh, this is a great photo, and shows it to a couple of the vets. And they're like, wait, if he's doing signals in the rear, why is he carrying a saw? Ask him why he's carrying a saw. And she's like, what? Of course, you know, what does this mean? Because, of course, you don't carry a heavy squad weapon if you're doing signals intelligence in the rear. So anyway, it's this process of decoding information. And so our chapter is about how information is knowledge, and how, particularly in the current era with an all-volunteer military, with so few Americans and American families directly experiencing the price, the cost of war. I mean, the economics affect us all, but the fingers get pointed in every which direction. People don't know what to believe. And it's really only the families of people who have serving soldiers and airmen and Marines and so on who really feel the effect of this war. And
those who have served in the past in wars.
Who understand.
Understand, yes. And that, I think that's the thing, like you said, when you first come back, you don't, first of all, you don't want to talk about the war, and if you're going to talk, you're not going to talk to civilians because they don't understand. The other is, I mean, it took me almost 35 some years, or 40 years to recognize I had post-traumatic stress, and then I knew earlier that I was affected by Agent Orange, but as well, my son Casey, who was born with congenital heart disease, and we both experienced you lost your brother when he was playing football, so almost around the same time, and so we had experienced a death in our families, which is pretty traumatic, no matter who you are, whether it's in war or at home or natural death. Whatever it might be, that kind of experience is something. And then my brother, who just passed away here July 6th, and just kind of a shout out to you too, Michael. You're still out there. I'm thinking of you almost every day. Who came and replaced me over in Vietnam, and whose own experience, he had his own demons, in which he medicated himself for so many years with alcohol, and eventually died of cirrhosis of the liver. But he had a feeling that he hated war. He hated the idea that we would kill innocent people in these wars. And for me, the trouble began when the wars started happening again. During the Central American conflicts, like I said, those children of war pictures began to just tear my heart apart, and I experienced that over and over again from one intervention after another. And then when the first war after 9/11, and then going into Afghanistan and then Iraq, and then we start hearing the deaths of the people, I began thinking about, like in Vietnam, it wasn't just the deaths of the people that I had witnessed, but also the deaths of so many of the Vietnamese I learned. And I didn't see the death of the Vietnamese that I know of, because my memory is faded, but that the idea, as I learned the history of almost 4 million people dying in that country, and a lot because of the spraying, and a lot because of the bombing, and we know what those bombs did in Afghanistan and Iraq, but especially in Iraq, in which millions of people fled the country. 2 million in-house, and 2 million went to Jordan, and estimated from hundreds of thousands to 1 million people killed, over a period of time. We began to wonder what this sort of vengeance of 9/11 means when innocent women and children. They're not specific targets, but then war becomes where not only the targets they call collateral damage, but they begin to, this damage is the damage of the mind as the soldier comes back. It's the damage of the mother who you're saying is worrying about her son, what's going to happen to him. One thing, in the mines, the cluster bombs that are laid out, not just in Iraq and Afghanistan, but we can talk about Israelis in Palestine and Gaza, children picking these things up. There's a history of what war leaves, not only for people, but for the environment. Right. And when I was in Vietnam, Agent Orange, I mean, there were no birds, there were no animals when I was there, and I used to hear people talk about the monkeys and the birds and even tigers, but there was nothing, just rats and a few scorpions and lots of mosquitoes and bugs, right? And when I started looking back more recently at the history of this stuff, forests totally destroyed, farmlands just poisoned, all this stuff being wiped out, and then the land being eroded because it didn't have its natural environment to veterans to take in the natural environment of water and animal life. All that fled, and they began to rebuild that country. I began to think personally that, you know, we have to look at how we're so interconnected in all of these things, the environment, the house, how we live our lives in this country. And Veterans for Peace is not just an advocate for veterans, but also an advocate for ending war, and war being one of the great atrocities of our history, and the history of many people. And you lived in the Middle East, and you hear about civil wars and these wars going on over and over in history. While you're there, you're teaching at a university. You're in Abu Dhabi. Mm-hmm. What is the history of Abu Dhabi? What do the people there think about the U.S. and its history? I mean, at one time I think we were thought of as this great nation that had sort of a democracy, a liberal kind of thing, and now are we being thought of as empire builders or military interventionists? What are they? Robber barons in corporate style. What is being thought of us?
Well, I mean, the impression of the United States, of course, in the Middle East is descended incredibly since 9/11 for a variety of reasons. But the invasion of Iraq, people in the UAE, in Abu Dhabi, in the neighboring countries were ambivalent about Iraq because of the 1990 invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein. So it's not like they thought of him as this great guy, but there is a hubris that everyone else seems to be able to recognize, just an overweening arrogance in the way that we went into Iraq in 2003, 2004, that made no sense to almost anyone, apart from apparently the Bush administration and people who at the time didn't know any better than to believe that somehow Iraq was behind 9/11, which anyone who was paying attention knew was a lie. Yeah, in Abu Dhabi and other parts of the Middle East, certainly in Pakistan, which is in South Asia, the United States has taken a real hit in terms of people's perception of what we are about. It's probably more a coming to reality about what the history of the 20th century has been in terms of increasing U.S. neo-imperialism around the world, and people are a lot more savvy about that. On the other hand, the United States, people still look to the United States for a lot of things, and so there's ambivalence. So in a country like the UAE, the United States de facto supplies the security against potential regional neighbors for the UAE, Saudi Arabia, neighboring countries who don't have great relations with Iran, for example. I guess my great concern is not just the money that we are in the lives that we're squandering that could be spent here, but even if we want to talk about an effective foreign policy in the world. Yeah. I mean, the situation in Pakistan today, if you can imagine Hurricane Katrina hitting not just the Gulf Coast, but the whole country all at once, that's what's happening in Pakistan right now. They're saying that about $40 to $50 billion to repair the damage. We've spent $1 trillion in direct costs on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, probably another 3 to 5 trillion in indirect costs for a tiny fraction of what we're still spending in Afghanistan to little or no effect that will do anyone any good other than a few arms manufacturers and security companies. We could have a tremendous impact on the redevelopment of Pakistan and actually doing something humane and effective in the region.
That's interesting. In this book that I have, Incoherent Empire by Michael Mann, it's a little outdated, but it's the same kind of thing. He talks about how people were, sort of first off this vengeance from 9/11, people going there without question. They started talking about, we had smart bombs, but smart bombs fell on people, innocent people, and I mean there were diplomatic means which were in the works. A request by the administration and the UN and others to demand that Osama bin Laden be turned over to the U.S. And the Taliban even was saying, well, if you produce the evidence, whether that's a stall or not, there were diplomatic means in which to talk about the criminal act, because even in countries all over the world, the so-called terrorist Muslim religious fanatics out there, everybody was appalled by the idea that the U.S. had been, innocent people had been targeted in 9/11. And people from all over the world came and helped. There were Muslims who died in the towers, and now we're hearing, this thing about the mosque being built on Ground Zero, which is actually a few blocks away and is a community center, is raising the temperature of racism in this country against Muslim, against. And branding everybody with the same brush as terrorists in this country. But even here the other day on the news, this cab driver who was Muslim, you saw that? Yet that was this guy, yeah, the guy who was a reporter who had been in Afghanistan or Iraq, I can't remember which place, but he was a reporter embedded with the military, and he had a picture of him with, I think, a young Afghani kid, and he comes in and he gets in this guy's cab and starts questioning him about being on Ramadan. This is the month of Ramadan, and the guy says, yeah, and he started asking me if he was a Muslim, and he said, yeah, and he said he just started to be quiet. He couldn't understand what this guy was getting at, and the next thing you know, I got to take you out, and he pulls a knife, puts it across the guy's throat, and there's a battle, struggle, he gets his shoulder cut. Well, I remember, and the racism when I was growing up against African Americans in this country, and this recent immigrant stuff, and now again Muslims are under attack. Even in 9/11 there was a lot of attacks on Muslims at that time, and that was anybody who had a Arabic-sounding name or Muhammad,
right?
And not everybody's Muslim that has those names either. But the same thing is that people start getting caught up in this sort of, I would say, mob mentality. And you studied this sort of mob mentality, and let's go back. We're going to go back a few years earlier, because when we're talking about racism, in a sense, I think all wars are racist in myself. I don't think you can go and kill another people that you think are your brothers and sisters, if we look at people that way, as I do. And, and so back in, what was it, in the 80s, 90s?
Late 80s.
Late 80s, you got involved with the Coalition for Human Dignity, which actually was an organization looking at racism here in Oregon and throughout Seattle and in the South. There was Mughal Surah, who was killed here in the streets of Portland. The Coalition for Human Dignity was built upon a Rock Against Racism concert, money given to a good friend of yours, and he pulled people together. And good friends of mine, who Abdi Hassan and Muhammad Hassan and Mahmoud Hassan, all three brothers were actively involved in that, and stood up for making sure that people recognized this was a racist attack. But there were these young, what you called skinheads, racist skinheads, that were being sort of, what was his name, Metzger?
Tom Metzger.
Tom Metzger, who had, what was the name of his organization? War?
Yeah, White Aryan Resistance.
White Aryan Resistance. And when we start, you know, there was sort of this sort of underground movement that started talking about, you know, taking over a new white nation. And it seems so familiar to me again, you know, we need to take back our country, we keep hearing. The Glenn Becks of society, the Sheriff Arpaio's of Arizona.
Right.
But they seem to have credibility. The skinheads didn't have, they were marginalized to an extent.
Well, skinheads represent the marginalized end of a social movement. They're that violent fringe that does the street side dirty work. No one is pushing their buttons and say, you do this, do this. This is spontaneous, ideologically driven by belief, by what people are sort of get upset about. And unfortunately, what people get upset about is when they think, when they see people who they are afraid of because they fear that they're different.
But there was one of the young men that was in there who said that, you know, he didn't have those basic attitudes right off the bat. He started reading. He felt marginalized in his community.
Right.
Yeah. And then as he started reading this material, it started being sort of self-evident to him, you know, right?
Yeah. Well, people don't get into the movement because they already have the beliefs usually. They get in because they meet someone who they become friendly with, and they get socially drawn into the movement for most people. And then they adopt the belief system, or at least any kind of coherent belief system that's grounded in this sort of fear and hatred of others. But it's the same idea with war, like you were saying, and war is based on the idea of social substitution. And what you have to do is you look at war as sort of being the opposite of crime. In crime, we punish people, but we don't just, if you commit a crime against the society, we can't come and attack your brother or your wife or someone who looks like you.
Right.
They're not equivalent to you. You're the one who has to be punished for that crime. But in war, that's the exact opposite.
And I have a right to defend myself in court and face my accusers, supposedly.
Well, in theory, in a liberal state, in a liberal state. But anyway, even in the most illiberal state, still, in theory, they're supposed to get the person who actually committed the crime, not one of his relatives or his friends or so on. But in war, that's exactly what you do. And of course, the logic in these particular wars is even more twisted than that, because we know that the people who committed 9/11 were mostly Saudi. And so what did we do? We attacked Afghanistan.
Right.
None of the perpetrators were Afghani. How does this make sense? It would be, you know, this would be like attacking Switzerland because...
and yet it won, a majority support of people were behind the Bush's war against Afghanistan.
Well, I mean, the Taliban regime was not it was an easy regime to dislike. And people had genuine concerns.
Well, again, women, you know, just recent photo of a woman's nose being cut off for adultery or whatever. But this happens in Saudi Arabia.
It happens everywhere. And in fact, of course, you know, that Time magazine article is what happens if we leave. Of course, this happened a couple of years ago when we were there. I mean, so what difference is it going to make?
Right.
The rhetoric when we went into Afghanistan is women's rights are non-negotiable. Of course, the more recent things that is coming from most people, actually Hillary Clinton has still stood by that, but everyone else has pretty much said, well, we have to be realistic. And realistic means that the same people who were running the country before, people with the same kinds of beliefs are going to be running the country again as soon as we leave.
I was, somebody wrote on Facebook, and it's interesting, you can really communicate with a lot of people, but one of the questions was by a former director of Veterans for Peace. The question basically was, what happens to the women when we leave Afghanistan? You know? And I mean, there were a lot of people replying, but I started looking into it, and I started thinking, the same thing that happens here in America. Domestic violence is horrible in this country, and violence against women in this country, I was reading statistics, I can't give them to you now because I don't have them in front of me, but you're talking about millions of women that have been killed, murdered, raped, 1 in 4 or something like that in this country. It's an epidemic, and so when we're talking about we'll send a whole nation to defend the women in Afghanistan, and yet we're not taking care of the women in this country, the hypocrisy and the very idea that it shouldn't be. It should be, yes, we support the rights of women everywhere. The women in Afghanistan were actually making some progress through negotiating, and I think that other ways of dealing with the problem, again, is like through diplomacy, through, as a nation begins to feel itself stable, you begin working through the UN, through NGOs, through a number of programs, and funding and various things can be denied or accepted or incentivized. You open this up. There was the guy that wrote 3 Cups of Tea.
Right.
And he's built so many schools for women. In that
he's written that recently that for the cost of keeping 100 American soldiers in Afghanistan, it cost about $1 million a year to keep 1 American soldier in Afghanistan. We could build enough schools in Afghanistan to send every Afghani child to school.
Now, see, that's what I mean. There's the cost of war. I mean, it really, really, really upsets. It makes me angry sometimes, and I have to go see my therapist every now and then because I get so upset. I get angry at this stuff. And yet, again...
But, I mean, I've been thinking about this recently because the increase in automated weapons, in
right.
drones and so on, and how this creates even another barrier between us and consequences.
Right.
And then I'm thinking back, it's easy to aim the venom at the Bush administration, but back during the Clinton administration, I'm going to go back just that far.
Right.
You have Al-Qaeda making terrorist attacks against American embassies in Africa, and how do we respond? We respond with cruise missiles launched at pharmaceuticals factories. Yeah. If someone commits a crime, you don't launch missiles at them.
Right.
This is not an appropriate, humane, liberal, in the best sense, response to a criminal act.
But weapons are domestic manufacturing export, isn't it?
Right. It's our biggest export.
Our biggest export, and so war profiteering seems to be the biggest economy in the world. That's I don't know how many people put their stock in the military, what's on Wall Street, but again, this idea of the economy, the war, the violence that occurs all over. I was talking to a young man, I think it was a couple days ago. He was one of my parking attendants who's actually from Mogadishu. Mm-hmm. And he's a Sufi Muslim, very peaceful natured religion, and persecuted by his own different, both the Shiite and the Sunni. And he's talked about how this culture of violence that's happening in the world seems like it's like a waterfall. And as the waterfall goes, it takes everything with it. And it seems like we're on this downhill path, and it's just eroding away all the human civil rights in this country and rights around the world by this continuing violence, the perpetual war.
Right. And
you're right, it's both administrations. I have no great favors, concerns of either party. And, I vote for people with integrity, hopefully. Or I don't vote at all. Simply because I can't bloody my hands with, I won't participate in anybody that supports war. I just can't, And I've been in arguments with people who are saying, well, we got to stop the Republicans. Oh, we got to stop these. We got to vote all Democrats. Well, some of the Democrats that they're talking about are hawks, I can't support them.
This is, in Pakistan, for example, the feeling is that because from most people is, even though they prefer the rhetoric of the Democrats,
right,
of thoughtful Democrats anyway, what Democrats actually tend to do is to act in a more aggressive kind of way with these adventures. So, I mean, the Obama administration has, against all sane advice, expanded the war in Afghanistan.
Isn't he pulling out?
Yeah, after the surge revisited in Afghanistan, and a year from now, of course, we're supposed to be pulling out. No one thinks that's going to happen, and if we do, that will be a disaster also. This is the situation that we're in. We've created a war in which to stay is a disaster and to leave is a disaster. So I mean, I guess to save the money and to save the lives from a purely self-interested point of view, pulling out is the right thing to do, but the country is already broken.
Well, next week too, we've got some time, but I wanted to mention this before I forget. I mean, next month, on the fourth Saturday, I'm going to have a woman named Lynn Braddock, whose son Travis was killed by cluster bomb munition while he was doing clearing in Karbala, Iraq. Since then, since 2007, she's spoken out against the use of cluster bombs, and as a part of an organization called, or started as a part of an organization called Band Advocates. So I met her here on August 1st. We did this thing called Beat the Drums Against Cluster Bombs, ban cluster bombs, a tribute to her son, because her son was a drummer, and so all these people came out. And she's an incredible lady, but she's also with military families speak out, has many close relationships with Veterans for Peace. You don't have to be a veteran to be a part of Veterans for Peace. There are associate members, again, parents and families, and just people who are against war. So if people are interested in getting involved in some of these issues, and you want to, I mean, everybody has a perspective. We're not against the soldier. We're there to support those soldiers. People make up their own minds why they go, oftentimes through propaganda, oftentimes because they believed in everything they were told. But as people have seen the wars and the violence, we've had a lot of veterans who just become conscious objectors, or they may not be conscious objectors, but they don't believe in these wars. They begin to learn and educate themselves as they go. We all mature over a period of time. For me, I still wouldn't call myself a conscientious objector, because I would be willing to defend my personal family. I would be willing to defend my country if it's under attack. But I don't believe in these adventurous wars, these wars of aggression, and it should be only in self-defense, and only, to me, that's my belief. But I do believe that we have a lot of different ways in which we can approach these things. I thought it was interesting today in the New York Times, you mentioned the Congo, report on the Congo killings, questions of genocide accounts, the new UN report talking about the Hutus going after, the Tutsis going after the Hutus who had committed genocide in their country and then fled into the Congo.
Right.
The poor Congo has suffered since King Leopold of Belgium. We go back into history and we begin to see this whole story, King Leopold's Ghost, a book I read, and I believe the author was Hirschfeld. I can't remember.
I forget
the name, but reading that book, I started thinking about how so much that was happening with the Bush administration, and the way in which he couched his terms for going to war were similar to the way the Belgium King Leopold started talking about why he was going in the Congo. He talked about going in there and freeing them from slavery and liberating the people. And that's what Bush started talking about. We're going to free them from the Taliban. We're going to free and liberate the people from Saddam Hussein. We're going to liberate the people and bring democracy to the country. Using those same terms and then creating even violence greater than those people they were supposedly saving them from. in Vietnam, the thing was, why were you in Vietnam? Really never got into real rational ideas on why they were there, except this sort of domino theory. There was this anti-communist belief, and there was just hegemony that they wanted to control. But one of the things, if we're going to save them from communism, even if we've got to kill every last one of them, you know, this mad theme in the minds of people, and some I really believe they believe that, you know. It wasn't just they had designs on grabbing the riches of a country. Some of them really believe those things over a period of time.
I think it's more sincere belief is more common than for most people. Of course, even the resource grabbers, the value of the resources that are grabbed are almost never going to equal the amount of money spent on the war to begin with. You have to grab something really rich for it to be more valuable than a modern army's going to war anyway, an American army. But they win on both sides, the war makers do, because first they steal the money from the American people to build the bombs and to drop them, and then they steal whatever's still retrievable from the country that they
Well,
invade.
we have about a minute and a half left here, and so I want to give you sort of the last word. I mean, this is, you know, we've covered a lot of ground here, and that's just my style, because I get so upset about these things. One thought leads to another. But I would like to give you, you know, you're living in those countries, you're looking at this perspective. What do you want to say to the American people?
I want to tell a story of a Pakistani cab driver in Abu Dhabi who I get in the cab, and he's almost in tears, and he asks me, where are you from? And I say the United States, and he says, tell Obama, please stop the killing. With my own eyes, I have seen 7 killed. The fathers, they don't care about themselves. They try to protect their children, but no place is safe. Tell Obama, please stop the killing.
That's very powerful. Well, I say, Obama, please stop the killing. And not just Obama, but all of us here in the U.S., we hold great responsibility for our leaders. They're supposed to be representing us, but oftentimes we have to push them into making the decisions that are right. And not just Veterans for Peace, but all of the organizations that believe in peace, and the religious organizations, interfaith communities that come together and believe that we're all human beings and we should care for each other. Thanks, Steve, for coming.
Thanks, Dan.
Glad to have you here, cousin.
It was a real pleasure.
Tell Angie Reed hi for me when
I
you
sure
get
will.
back. Thank you very much.